Herodotus, who is known as the father of history, Eratosthenes of Cyrene, Strabo, Pomponius Mela, and Claudius Ptolemy of Alexandria. And these geographers lived centuries after the fall of the Assyrian Empire. But in the maps of the world that they drew at their time, they always included Assyria. If there were no people that at that time identifying as Assyrians or being identified by their neighbors as Assyrians, this would not be the case. Now, with the development of Christianity and the spread of the Church of the East and the Church of Antioch, Assyria remained as the name of an ecclesiastical province, a major metropolitan archdiocese of the Church, which lasted from 410 AD until 1813. Its first major centers were at Erbil and Hazza, which is close to Erbil, and this area had a bishop since 104 AD, until its see was moved to Mosul in 780. Later on, in the 17 and 1800s, these two were absorbed into the Chaldean Catholic Church. But you can see all the bishoprics, or all of the bishops' dioceses, which belonged to this big metropolitan archdiocese of Atur or Assyria, and it extended all the way to Urmia. Now, I've heard a lot of people that say people from Urmia are not really Assyrians, they're from Iran, they're Persians who speak Assyrian. It's not true. Urmia was always considered a very essential part of the Assyrian homeland, and this is proven by the ecclesiastical organization of the Church of the East from 410 AD until the 1800s. So, at the same time, Assyria and Assyrians appear in maps of the Middle East and of the Ottoman and Persian empires created by Europeans between the 16th and 19th centuries. So we can safely say, so you can see here, even this is a map from 1626 of the Ottoman or Turkish Empire, and here in the margins you've got a Greek, an Egyptian, an Assyrian, and his wife. Okay, Assyria again. These are more maps from the Middle Ages. Let me skip that one for now. So this is evidence that the Assyrian identity geographically, in terms of a land, appears to have been continuous in the same area for a total of nearly 2.5 millennia without the need of us having a state. It never went away, even though the Arabs and Kurds gradually became the dominant ethnic groups in the area. And some Assyrians changed their sects and of course their names to whatever, Chaldean, whatever, to those of other peoples of other geographical areas. If there were no Assyrian people living in those areas with no Assyrian identity in all of those time periods, all of this recurrent usage of the geographical term Assyria would have been impossible. So I'm going to go on to, so we'll leave the geography for a second and we'll go to ourselves, to our name, what we call ourselves, okay? Again, many scholars and anti-Assyrian separatists deny the continuity of the Assyrian name after the fall of the Assyrian Empire from 612 to 605. Actually, it never went out of use. The Assyrian national and linguistic identities have survived until today without an independent state for over 2,600 years, even though many of those who have continued to use these identities may not agree, and I'm going to explain. So Assyrians do not just associate themselves with some ancient empire which was rediscovered in the 19th century. In their own particular dialects, all Aramaic-speaking Christians that originate from northern Mesopotamia, geographically speaking, from Tur Abdin in Turkey to Urmia in Iran, and from the city or Lake Van in Turkey down to Kirkuk in Iraq, whom we would identify as being Assyrians, irrespective of their religious denominations, be they from the Chaldean Church, or be they from the Syriac Orthodox Church, or the Church of the East, call themselves Suraye. We all know this name. Suraye or Suroye. And they call their language Surat or Surait or Surat. In addition to the common literary name that we find in the books in classical Syriac, which is Suryaya or Suryoyo. These are names that were historically used by, well, the names Surat and Suraya were names that were historically used by illiterate people with no educations, of all ages and of all Christian sects and denominations, to identify themselves in their language. So let's go into what these words mean and where they come from. These words derive from the more ancient designations Asurayi, from the ancient Akkadian language Asurayi, which later became Surai, means Assyrians, and Assuritum, Lishanum Assuritum, the Assyrian language, Surat. Okay, it doesn't mean Christian. Despite the fact that non-Assyrian scholars have incorrectly translated these words as Syrian or Syriac, and many of the people who use these names have since come to equate their meaning with being Christian, which is not true. Suraya and Surat does not mean Masihi. It does not mean Christian. It means Assyrian. Usually, these people that think that Suraya means Assyrian come from isolated communities, far from other Christian groups such as the Armenians, and they also call Muslims, all Muslims, Kurds or Arabs. At the same time as calling all Christians Assyrians or Suraya, they call all Muslims Kurds, which is not possible. Okay, but this is done by people. Or they call them Taye, Tayoye, which is an Arabic tribe. Anyhow, one of the first times in which the word, okay, so here you can see the development, sorry, before I move on to this. You can see the development of the word Suraya from Surayu, which came from Asurayu and Ashurayu, Ashuraya, Benunat Ashur, Assyrians. And even the change between Athuraya, Asuraya, and Suraya, which is very common in various dialects of Assyrian. You have people that say Betha, Beta, Besha, Besa, and even between different Aramaic languages, Semitic languages. So, I can go back to this later in more detail. Now, one of the first times in which the word Suraya, or Suroyo in particular, was shown to be a development of the word Asurayu, or Assyrian, comes from the Chaldean Arabic dictionary written by Bishop Jacques Eugene Manna, who was from the Chaldean Catholic village of Bacopa, published in Mosul in 1900. On page 47, he says, Suraya means Suryani, Arami, Nasrani, ikhtisar Asuraya ay Athuraya. It means Syriac, Aramaic or Aramean, Christian, an abbreviation of Asuraya or Athuraya. So this Chaldean bishop from 116 years ago admits that the word Suraya means Assyrian. It comes from Assyrian. Now, Manna was the Chaldean Catholic bishop of Van in Turkey, and he hailed from the village of Bacopa in the Nineveh plain, which is now abandoned and on the ISIS front lines. In the introduction of another Chaldean dictionary published in Mosul in 1897, 3 years earlier, called The Treasury of the Syriac Language, Simtad Lishana Suryaya, Archbishop Thomas Odo openly states that the word Suryaye or Suryoye is a later development of Athuraye or Othuroye, Assyrians. Odo himself was the Chaldean Catholic bishop of Urmia in Iran, which I just mentioned, and he was from Al-Qush, which is also in the Nineveh plain. Now, this theory was confirmed as fact by esteemed Assyriologist Professor Simo Parpola from the University of Helsinki in Finland, who found ancient textual evidence to support it. It is also confirmed by the discovery and translation of the Çineköy inscription in modern-day Turkey. The point linking the words Suryaya or Suraya and Asuraya was thus again successfully demonstrated by Professor Robert Rollinger from Leopold Franzens University in Austria in his article, The Terms Assyria and Syria Again. which depends heavily on this inscription. His work also confirms an earlier one by the late Professor Richard Fry of Harvard, Assyria and Syria synonyms, in which he went through various Greek sources which correlate the names Assyria and Syria, showing that they're the same. Now, the name Suraya is additionally close to what the Assyrians are called by their Persian, Armenian, and Georgian neighbors, respectively Asuri, Asuri, and Asureri, as well as close to what the Arabs and Turks call them, which is Suryani. And a lot of people don't know what the word Suryani means, especially Eastern Assyrians. They think Suryani is that church over there which we don't go to. It's the Suryani people. They're like us, but they're not from our church. No, we're all Suryan. We're all Suryani. We are Eastern Suryani, which means Assyrian, and they are Western Suryani, Western Assyrians. Because the word Suryani comes from the Middle Persian word Asuriyan. Asuriyan, the Assyrians. Assyrian. The Armenians, who have especially lived with the Assyrian or Syriac Christians for centuries in countries such as Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, make no distinction between the sectarian identities that we have and call all of us Asuri or Assyrian. It doesn't matter if we belong to the Syriac Orthodox Church of Antioch or the Chaldean Church or the Church of the East. They say you're all Asuri. You're all Assyrians. In Armenian, that word denotes an ethnic Assyrian, as opposed to the word Asuristansi, which rather denotes the citizen or inhabitant of a hypothetical state of Assyria. In contrast, the names Aturaya or Othuroyo or Ashuri, Athuri, which are preferred by nationalists because of their more direct connotations with the ancient Assyrians, and as an archaism or return to the roots of the word, were only adopted and popularized after the development of the Assyrian nationalist movement in the early 20th century. And there's an interesting parallel with the Greeks. Up until maybe the 1800s, the Greeks never called themselves Hellenes, or Greeks, Hellenes. They used to call themselves Romans. And it actually took a very long time for them to change from calling themselves Rum to calling themselves Hellenes. So, I'm going to go on to the last century of conflicts in the Middle East, because it's very important as a background as to why we're here today. Last year, the Assyrians commemorated a century since the beginning of the genocide in the Ottoman Empire, which led to the annihilation of between 500,000 and 750,000 Assyrians in parts of that empire, as well as in modern-day Iran. It was also a time during which over 150,000 Assyrians became refugees in present-day Russia, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. All were internally displaced, as entire regions that were once populated by Assyrian majorities were emptied out forever. It should be noted that the century prior to that was also marked with tragedies, including the massacres of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Assyrians by Kurdish Prince Muhammad Pasha of Rawanduz in the 1820s, or Mirakor, by Kurdish Prince Badr Khan Bek in the 1840s, in what became known as the Caliphate massacres, and today ISIS is talking about a caliphate again, and the Hamidiyya massacres, which were conducted under the Ottoman Empire between 1894 and 96, as well as the massacres in and around the town of Adana in Turkey in 1909. Since then, so since 1915 or 1914, the Assyrians have endured a total of 12 cases of forced displacement, which, in addition to the many conflicts that have ravaged the Middle East, have dislodged them to the extent that of the estimated 3 million Assyrians that live worldwide, there are now fewer than 250,000 remaining on our traditional lands in the Middle East. Actually on the lands of Assyria, only 250,000, maybe 300. Nearly half of those are actually internally displaced, in addition to more than half of the total population of Assyrians which currently live outside of the homeland or the Middle East in the diaspora. Yet we are still there, even though Our numbers are small, we're still there. And for those of us in the diaspora, we have not forgotten our roots or our brothers and sisters in the homeland. Now, among the litany of forced displacements and conflicts that have occurred within that space of time, I would like to mention the following. So, after the Assyrian genocide of 1915, and this iconic image, which is one of the rare images that we have of the massacres conducted in Urmia at that time under the Ottoman army. And if people remember what happened in 2014 and what happened last year in Khabur, this has been repeating itself over the last 100 years, this same image. So these are images from about 100 years ago of the Assyrian refugees from Hakkari in Turkey that were refugees in Iran, in Urmi. Now, the escape of 90,000 Assyrian and Armenian refugees from the city of Urmia in northwest Iran during the climax of the Assyrian genocide in 1918, over a 1,000-mile journey, covered largely on foot, to a refugee camp set up by the British at Ba'quba, just north of Baghdad. About 40,000 of these people died or were lost on the way. When, by the way, these photographs are in the Australian War Memorial Archives. If you didn't know, these photographs were taken by Aussie diggers who were part of the Dunster Force, which had gone over there as part of a secret military operation. These photographs were taken by Aussies, and a lot of our people don't know that evidence of the Assyrian genocide is actually held in the Australian archives. These are Assyrian refugees fleeing from Urmia in 1918 to Ba'quba. Now when this camp, this is a rare image of the Ba'quba camp, when this camp was closed in 1921, thousands of the refugees returned to their homes in the districts of Urmia and Hakkari in current Iran and Turkey respectively. Of the majority who did not, some immigrated to the United States, and the bulk was transported to another camp in northern Iraq, from which they were dispersed in mostly new settlements across that part of the country. And as we will see, this situation was not to last very long. In 1924 to 1925, during the closing stages of the Assyrian genocide, the nascent Turkish Republic under General Mustafa Kemal, better known as Ataturk, expelled the thousands of Assyrians who had returned to Hakkari, as well as those who had remained in their villages along Iraq's northern border in districts north and west of the town of Zakhor, depopulating areas they had inhabited for more than 2,700 years. This period additionally saw the end of the millennia-old Assyrian community of Edessa. So here, I'm going to be talking about these places. These are areas which Assyrians lived in Turkey until 1924 and 25, and areas in Iraq and Syria to which they were pushed out by the government of Ataturk, who is now hailed as a hero and a man of peace by, well, let's not go there for now. So, this period also saw the end of the millennia-old Assyrian community of Edessa, which I mentioned earlier, which along with that of the nearby town of Siverek, a total of 500 families, was evacuated to Aleppo in Syria, or Halab, in order to save its members' lives, on the condition that they would never again return to their homes. Also during this time, a number of Assyrians were uprooted from their ancient communities in the districts of Kharput, Diyarbakir, Mardin, and Turabdin during Turkey's brutal suppression of the failed rebellion by Kurdish leader Sheikh Said. These refugees ended up settling in and around the string of towns along Syria's northeast border with Turkey in places such as Rish Aino, Ras Al Ain, Ad-Dirbasiya, Qamishli or Berzalin, Qabr Heware, Al-Qahtaniya, and Derik, Al-Malikiya. In August 1933, up to 3,000 Assyrians were slaughtered in what became the first genocidal campaign conducted by the Iraqi government against its own citizens, before Saddam's campaign against the Kurds in Anfal and Halabja. The Iraqi levies, a mercenary army based around Assyrian refugees from Turkey and Iran, formed by the British in 1918, were not allowed to defend their brothers and sisters from massacre, even though their suppression of Kurdish revolts in 1919 to 1924 and 1931 to 32 had contributed to the successful establishment of Iraq as an independent state with its own territorial integrity. It goes without saying that the few Assyrians living in areas where those revolts occurred were also adversely affected. The Iraqi military was responsible for the 1933 massacres, which occurred largely in and around the Assyrian town of Simmel, as well as the looting and razing of more than 60 settlements, most of which were never rebuilt. This resulted in the escape of more than 12,800 refugees to Syria, where they eventually settled in a total of 36 villages in the northwest of the town of Al-Hasaka. So here you can see actual photographs of the refugees from Iraq after the Simmel genocide and the new villages that they had established along the Khabur. And this is a map of some of these villages. And many of you will have heard about their names from last February when ISIS stormed these villages and took more than 250 people hostage. During the Second World War, the Assyrian levies were deployed in various European countries by their British superiors and were required to defend the Royal Air Force base at Habbaniya against attacks from the Iraqi military in 1941. Now, the closure of this base in 1959 led to the dispersal of a community of 10,000 Assyrians to various urban centers of Iraq. In December 1946, the historic Assyrian communities around the city of Urmia were again dealt a fatal blow with the massacre of scores of youths and intellectuals associated with the failed Soviet-backed Azerbaijan People's Republic, what the Assyrians later referred to as the Democrat War, or Plash Demokrat. During this time, the Iranian military looted some of the wealthiest Assyrian villages and conducted revenge killings on those who had cooperated with the failed republic. Prior to that year, there had been a notable increase in the populations of the Assyrian villages since their resettlement in 1921 by returnees from the refugee camps in Iraq and the former Soviet Union, despite Kurdish revolts. After 1947, however, these villages began to decline as their inhabitants migrated to the relative safety and better living standards of larger cities in Iran such as Hamadan, Kermanshah, Qazvin, and above all the capital of Tehran. Between 1961 and 1970, during the First Iraqi-Kurdish War, the Assyrians remaining in the mountainous districts of Iraq again came under attack. Nearly 120 Assyrian villages were affected in the violence that ensued, as Assyrians were caught in the crossfire by Iraqi government troops and Kurdish rebels, with Assyrians such as Margaret Giwargis Shello often found fighting on the Kurdish side as well as the government side. Now, this period saw the abandonment of many of these 120 villages as their inhabitants left for safer lives in the larger urban centers such as Mosul, Kirkuk, Basra, Baghdad, or immigrated to the west. Again, with the ascendancy of the Arab nationalist Ba'ath Party in Iraq and Syria from 1963 onwards, many Assyrians began to leave these countries because they did not want to be identified as Arabs and began to no longer feel at home in their own home countries. And this is why the community here in Australia started to grow from the 1960s onwards, actually. Additionally, Assyrian conscripts in the Iraqi and Syrian militaries were involved in fighting during the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War against Israel in 1967 and 1973, in which many of them lost their lives for a war between Arabs and Jews which they had nothing to do with. In September 1969, 23 Assyrian civilians were massacred along with 14 of their Yazidi and Kurdish neighbors by the Iraqi government in the village of Soria. Between 1974 and 1978, during the Second Iraqi-Kurdish War, more than 50 Assyrian villages in northern Iraq were affected by the violence. Many of their inhabitants had returned to their homes after the declaration of Kurdish autonomy by the Iraqi government in 1970. During this time, 3 Assyrian villages were turned into collective towns, mujamma'at, and settled with both Kurds and Assyrians from other districts. Some Assyrians were moved to 2 other collective towns established from scratch and forced to live alongside people from hostile Kurdish tribes. Again, many Assyrians moved to the country's urban centers or immigrated to the west. Between 1975 and 1990, roughly, Assyrians that had immigrated to Lebanon, largely from Syria, but also from Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, were caught up in the violence as they struggled to maintain the communities that they had formed, with many either being provided with Lebanese citizenship or eventually moving to the West. Iran's Islamic Revolution in 1979 and the period that followed led to an exodus of Assyrians from that country. We know before this there were roughly 100, some say 150, some say 300,000 Assyrians living in Iran. Now there's only about 15 to 20,000. Okay? And this is what triggered it. Because they did not wish to live under an Islamic government, so most of them immigrated to the West. Between 1980 and 1988, up to 60,000 Assyrians were killed either as soldiers or civilian casualties in the Iran-Iraq War. These deaths came from both Assyrians of Iraq as well as Assyrians of Iran and resulted in more immigration to Western countries. Now this photo is of a mother and daughter sitting alongside the grave of their son, who was an Iranian soldier who died in the Iran-Iraq War. A lot of Assyrians talk about Assyrian martyrs or shuhada that were killed during the war from Iraq, but we never really hear about the Assyrians from Iran. There are many of them. Between 1980 and 1988, between 1983 and 1981, during another Kurdish rebellion against Baghdad, in which Assyrian parties and fighters also participated, and which resulted in the Anfal campaign. Another 40 villages were affected. Many of these, however, were resettled by their Assyrian inhabitants after the re-establishment of local autonomous rule and UN-enforced no-fly zone in April 1991. Between 1984 and 1998, sorry, there are a lot of dates, I hope I don't confuse you all. I'm almost done, by the way. Between 1984 and 1998, scores of Assyrian urban and rural communities in Turkey were affected by the ongoing conflict between the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, and the Turkish military. This led to the immigration of tens of thousands of Assyrians to Western European countries such as France, Sweden, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, and Austria, and the burgeoning of the diaspora communities there. Their numbers in Turkey had already been thinned out due to the effects of the unfair wealth tax imposed by the Turkish government, the Varlık Vergisi, which was levied against non-Muslims in 1942, the pogroms against the Greeks of Istanbul in 1955, as well as the conflict in Cyprus between 63 and 74. It was a conflict between Turks and Greeks, but the Assyrians and Armenians in Turkey also opted because they were identified as Christians like the Greeks. I should note that despite many Assyrians having returned to their villages since 2001, the Assyrians have again suffered as a result of the resumption of hostilities between the two parties since last year, with the damage and confiscation of Assyrian churches and properties in the city of Diyarbakir. Now, this is one of the Assyrian villages which was abandoned during the conflict. This is one of the families that was kicked out of its village in 1994 for the last time. And this is an image of Diyarbakir, or Ahmed in Assyrian, Omid, during the fighting last year between the PKK and the Turkish military. And one of the churches in that city that was damaged or badly affected. Finally, the Gulf War between 1990 and 1991. The chaos since the US-led intervention in the country in 2003 and the intervening period of economic sanctions against Iraq. The Syrian civil war since 2011, have led to a steady drain of Assyrians from those two countries as they migrate to Western countries to seek better lives. The situation has been especially bad since 2003, with more than 413 Assyrians killed between April 10, 2003 and June 25, 2013, and 48 churches attacked or bombed, leaving 95 more people dead. Now, it's not about the numbers, really. It's about the fact that as a minority, whether you're indigenous or not, any death affects you numerically. And any immigration that's caused by those deaths affects your presence in the homeland. Even though everybody is suffering, but minorities suffer more. The events of 1915 and 1918 were again repeated 100 years later in 2014 with the invasion of Mosul, Sinjar, and the Nineveh plain by ISIL, and the abandonment of more than 20 Assyrian towns and villages, followed by an ISIL attack and invasion of the 36 Assyrian villages along the Khabur River, which I just mentioned, resulting in the kidnapping of more than 250 civilians. The Nineveh plain is still under ISIL occupation, and refugees have been living in shipping containers and tents and unfinished buildings for nearly 2 years now. So I'm coming to the conclusions. In total, Assyrians in the Middle East have only lived through about 30 years in the last 100 years, in which there were no conflicts, wars, genocides, massacres, displacements, revolutions, etc. We need to face the reality that such circumstances have become part and parcel of our existence in the regions, as well as part of the diaspora psyche. Despite the fact that we have survived resiliently and resisted assimilation and extinction for over more than 2,600 years, for much of it without the aid of churches or religious institutions. Let's not forget that between 612 BC, when the empire fell, and the beginning of Christianity, we didn't have churches to keep our identity. We kept our identity by ourselves, okay? And unfortunately, many of us are now using our churches as a crutch today to lean on. Assyrians are now at a turning point in their history, where more than half of them are currently living outside of the Middle East. Rather than just stand by, however, as passive observers in what is essentially affecting us existentially and directly as a people, allowing other external actors, whether locally or internationally, to control our affairs or the situation at hand, Assyrians, as I said before, need to become more confident, more assertive, and take control of their own political destiny and self-determination in the future. We are not minorities. We are indigenous people with God-given rights which we demand. No one should give them to us. We need to take them. We will no longer accept the scraps from someone else's feast. We want our own feast. And we should no longer accept another genocide against the Assyrian nation. Diaspora Assyrians need to get over their guilt of having left their brothers and sisters behind in the homeland, and become more proactive in terms of regrouping and preserving their identity and language wherever they reside. At the same time as helping them, diaspora Assyrians need to also focus on strengthening themselves as communities and fostering pride in their resilient identity. A weak and assimilated Assyrian diaspora can do nothing to significantly aid in the improvement of the situation for those remaining in the Middle East. Assyrians now should be thinking outside of the box and developing new strategies in order to preserve their tangible and intangible heritages. This includes participating fully in the political lives of all the countries in which they live, including Australia, and participating intellectually through the establishment of Assyrian schools, chairs at universities, as well as think tanks and research institutes. So far, many of us have hidden behind the veils of our churches and religious institutions. with the excuse that they have been a constant in our lives and have maintained their identity, when they have also in part divided our nation, halted our enlightenment, and allowed us to be weak and subservient to our more powerful neighbors. We need to grow out of our religious institutions while still respecting them for the role that they have played for us historically. I stress the need for us to develop new strategies, however, because to continue the same one of Christian martyrdom, victimhood, etc., that many have perpetuated until today has not helped us and only served to make us weaker. A wise man once said that if you do the same thing repeatedly with the same negative result, but hoping for it to yield you a positive one instead, then you must be insane. I know that Assyrians are much more intelligent than that. Right now, I believe that the Assyrian struggle is one of existence, with the main challenge being how to maintain Assyrian culture, language, and identity without a state, just as we've been doing for the last 2,600 years. Be Assyrian before Assyria happens. You can't have Assyria happen if you are not Assyrian yourselves. I don't think the Assyrian should have too much trouble with this though, if only they focus their energies and concentrate their efforts and talents on positive and constructive projects. Above all, the Assyrians are survivors first and foremost, and they should never, ever forget that. Thank you very much.
Amen.